The ICF Training and Technical Assistance Team is honored to welcome you to this California Housing and Community Development Community Workshop offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant, Coronavirus Relief Consulting, and Staffing Services Contract. I am Chris Pitcher from ICF, and I'll be hosting today's session. Today's training session is part of our new non-traditional provider workshop series. And today we're going to be handling ESG and ESG-CV emergency shelter. It is my distinct pleasure to hand it to our first presenter, Mike Thomas. Mike, take it away, please.
Thank you, Chris. So my name is Michael Thomas. I use he, him pronouns. I am a technical assistance provider with ICF, and I'll be presenting today with my colleague, Gordon. So I'll let Gordon introduce himself really quickly before we get started.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Gordon Levine. My pronouns are he, him. I am white and Jewish, and I am with ICF as well. Please do take a moment to introduce yourself in your chat, name, pronoun, and which organization you work with, as we love to know who we're presenting to. Thanks, Mike.
Yep, thank you, Gordon. So we will go ahead and get started. As you can see on the screen there, our topic for today is emergency shelter. So we'll be talking about ESG-funded emergency shelter. Our agenda for today, in the first hour or so, we're going to do an overview of ESG emergency shelter. We're then going to talk about COVID-19 waivers and alternative requirements that apply to ESG-funded emergency shelter. And then we'll go through some best practices. After that, once we get into hour two, we'll take a quick break, and then we will do our lightning round, which is where we will ask you some questions. We'll pop up some polls and see what we have learned from the session. And then we'll have time at the end for question and answer. Quick reminder that we like to throw in at the beginning of all of these. We are focused on the subrecipient and sub-subrecipient level in this training. So this is mostly applicable to California HCD's direct subrecipients of ESG and to organizations that receive ESG from those subrecipients. So those are sometimes known as sub-subrecipients. So ESG has different levels in the funding. It starts off at HUD, then it goes to California HCD. We're not focused on that level here. We are focused on the subs and the sub-subs. Some key vocabulary to go through. In the HUD world, we always live in alphabet soup. So just going to point out some of the letters we will be talking about if you hear these throughout the presentation. ESG is the Emergency Solutions Grant Program. ESG-CV is the Emergency Solutions Grant funding provided through the CARES Act. ES is going to be emergency shelter projects funded through ESG or ESG-CV. If you see FY, that is the fiscal year. That's the year in which ESG funds are allocated by HUD. CAHCD is the California Department of Housing and Community Development, which is the largest ESG recipient in California. HUD is the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. A recipient is an entity that receives ESG directly from HUD. In this context, when we say that, we're primarily talking about California HCD. A subrecipient is a local government entity or nonprofit that receives ESG from a recipient. Sometimes they're called grantees, but we try to stick to subrecipient in these presentations. And then I always like to point out, maybe the least attractive acronym is UGLUG. That is a unit of general local government. And then another quick reminder we like to throw out there is how regulations and policies interact. So when we talk about the federal rules and the state rules and all of that, there are multiple layers that you think about in terms of compliance with an ESG project. So it starts with the federal uniform guidance that applies across all federal projects, and it covers how you administer the project, it covers the contracting, and it covers the cost principles and things like that. And then below that level is the ESG interim program rule. That governs all ESG projects. And then you have HUD guidance. So that includes HUD's responses to frequently asked questions. It includes guidance that they might give to you through the Ask a Question portal. And in this context, I'm also categorizing here the ESG CV notice and other documents that have come out applying waivers to ESG funding due to COVID-19. And then you have local policies. So that's things like continuum of care written standards and things that might apply locally to your project. In order to be fully compliant, an ESG project has to be aligned with all of these things. And typically it gets narrower from the top down. So the ESG interim rule might specify some things that are a little narrower than the uniform guidance, and then the HUD guidance below that might get a little narrower, and then local policies might even get a little narrower. So it tends to funnel down like that. I will now turn it over to Gordon to get us started on the basics of emergency shelter.
All right, thank you, Mike. Let's get into it. Next slide, please. All right, emergency shelter. According to the ESG program interim rule, which is at 24 CFR 576.102, which is on your screen, so you don't have to remember it. Emergency shelter involves providing essential services to homeless families and individuals in emergency shelters, renovating buildings to be used as emergency shelter for homeless families and individuals, and operating emergency shelters. Next slide, please. So an overview, emergency shelter really provides for the following things. First, it's the cost of building, maintaining, and operating an emergency shelter, which includes the services and case management offered at the shelter to its residents. Emergency shelter really means temporary and immediate residence. Temporary and immediate can mean a lot of different things, but generally speaking, we're talking about something with fewer accommodations than housing. It's okay that it's less nice than permanent housing because it's not intended to be permanent housing. It is a temporary destination. Emergency shelter can be congregate or non-congregate, and it can include hotel, motel vouchers if no other shelter is available and accessible, which requires some demonstration from the shelter provider that that is true. Finally, emergency shelter serves people who are or who will be tonight experiencing literal homelessness, which includes people who are fleeing domestic violence, a definition which encapsulates people who are fleeing human trafficking, as well as other definitions that we'll touch on in a moment. Next slide, please. Eligible participants. Next slide. So eligible participants, this is pretty wordy. We're going to go through the whole thing, but again, the slide is really your reference for this. Eligible participants, the first category is HUD's category 1 of homelessness, also called literal homelessness. It refers to an individual or family who lacks a fixed, regular nighttime residence, which means one of the following: that they have a primary nighttime residence that is a public or private place that is not meant for human habitation, or that they are living in a publicly or privately operated shelter that is designed to provide temporary living arrangements, which includes congregate shelters and non-congregate shelters, transitional housing, and hotel motels if those hotel motel vouchers are paid for by charitable organizations or government programs, or the participant or family is exiting an institution, which includes jail or prison, a physical health institution like a hospital, a mental health institution, or a juvenile care facility like a foster care facility, where they have lived for 90 days or fewer, and immediately before entering that facility, they resided in another place mentioned in one of the previous two parts of the definition. So an emergency shelter or a place not meant for human habitation. It's category 1. Category 4 refers to people who are fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, which refers to any individual or family who meets all 3 of the following criteria. Number 1, they're fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, which includes sexual assault, stalking, dating violence, and human trafficking, which we touch on at the bottom of this section. And they have no other identified residence, and they lack the support networks to obtain other permanent housing. Again, you need to proactively establish those, but when it comes to people who are fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, third-party certification is always acceptable. And as it says at the bottom, fleeing domestic violence or attempting to flee domestic violence is understood to include survivors of human trafficking, which at this point exists at the policy level at HUD, but is being codified at the federal level in multiple places, including the 2022 VAWA reauthorization. One thing that I will highlight here is, thank you, Mike, I appreciate it. One thing that I will highlight here is that if you attended previous sessions on that we've delivered on other components of ESG, like rapid rehousing, for example, you've seen that really the core eligibility criteria, for example, for rapid rehousing is literal homelessness. And people who are fleeing domestic violence are absolutely a population that can be served, but the core criterion is literal homelessness. It's literal homelessness or it's fleeing DV and also experiencing literal homelessness. For emergency shelter, those two are decoupled. A shelter can serve people who are either or experiencing literal homelessness or fleeing domestic violence, which means that you can have emergency shelters that serve exclusively people fleeing domestic violence, though you cannot have shelters that exclude people fleeing domestic violence. Thank you, Mike. Next slide, please. All right. Eligible participants also include people who are at imminent risk of homelessness, who will lose housing within 14 days, have no subsequent residence, and lack the support networks to remain housed. So they're folks who are transitioning into the emergency shelter situation. And it includes people who meet HUD's Category 3 definition. But since no projects in California are approved to serve that definition, we're not going to address it further, and we suggest you forget all about it. Next slide, please. Special note on documenting eligibility. And this is really a critical point that I think a lot of folks, even in communities with really high knowledge of ESG regulations, can sometimes miss. So I would say this is a great place to pay special attention. Projects are required to document eligibility for emergency shelter in the same way that they document it for other ESG funded projects. However, HUD has recognized in writing that third-party documentation is not feasible in most cases for emergency shelter participants. For emergency shelter, self-certification is always acceptable, and self-certification can look different for emergency shelter than it does for other project types. And the specific example that HUD gives in the FAQ that's linked at the bottom of the slide is, for example, you can have a sign-in sheet at the door that has a statement at the top that says, by signing here, I'm self-certifying that I meet the definition of literal homelessness, that I tonight will be sleeping in a place that is not meant for human habitation, such as XYZ. And by signing and dating, that meets the eligibility requirements, the documentation requirements for emergency shelter. Finally, be aware that the lack of third-party documentation must never prevent someone from being immediately admitted to shelter. And so what that means is if someone shows up to shelter, whatever your internal documentation process is, you cannot turn someone away at the door because you can't verify that absent shelter, they will experience literal homelessness. You can't do it. Next slide, please. All right, back over to you, Mike.
Thank you. So we will get into eligible activities. I will note that as we start, we're thinking about eligible activities under your regular annual ESG, and then we're going to have a section a little later where we will dive into the waivers around ESG CV and COVID-19 response. In general, these are the categories of eligible activities. So you've got essential services, renovation, shelter operations, and assistance required under URA, which is something we'll talk about in a moment. It's not common, but we did want to include that. Under essential services, these are what you find in the regulation. We find case management, childcare, education services, employment assistance, outpatient health services, mental health services, legal services, substance abuse treatment services, life skills training, and transportation. Some of these do benefit from further explanation, which we are going to jump into right now. So case management is very broadly defined. There is not a lot of specificity in the regulation about what it is, but it includes coordinated entry activities, diversion and rapid exit activities, and providing information and referrals to other providers. And that is, of course, in addition to your standard case management activities, meeting with clients, discussing their housing plans, things of that nature. Under health services, both physical and mental health services must be outpatient only. You can be creative with these. So for example, the cost of on-site care, including primary care, dentistry, psychiatry, and psychology, can be eligible. It's important to note, once again, it must be outpatient, it must be in a community-based setting, which can include the shelter, and it is to the extent that these services are not otherwise available to the participant. And then we have legal services, which again, there are a few specifics in the regs that we want to touch on here. So it includes child custody and emancipation issues, DV protection and civil remedies, and resolving outstanding criminal warrants. This is only to the extent that these affect housing. So to the extent that these things are a barrier to obtaining permanent housing, it's eligible under legal services. And then for transportation, it must be participant travel or staff travel to support participants. And that includes purchasing a vehicle and the associated upkeep and ongoing costs for that vehicle. It includes mileage allowances when staff use their own cars to transport participants for essential services. And it includes public transit costs, again, provided to participants so they can access essential services. In the renovation category, eligible costs include labor, materials, and tools, major rehab of an existing shelter, and conversion of a building into shelter. If you're paying for renovation, the building must be owned by a nonprofit or government entity, and there is a minimum period of use. So renovations and conversions have this minimum period of use requirement. We're going to discuss it on the next slide. I will note, I don't think funding is being provided for this by California HCD. So we just want to, acknowledge that, but we also want to cover everything here that we know is eligible under ESG at the federal level so that you're aware of it. So under renovation for the minimum periods of use, and this is a really important thing to pay attention to when we talk about renovation, because these are long-term commitments, and this outlines what that looks like. So if the rehabilitation cost exceeds 75% of the reasonable monetary value of the building before the rehab is carried out, then the building must be maintained as an emergency shelter for 10 years. If the cost to convert a building into an emergency shelter exceeds 75% of the reasonable monetary value after the conversion is completed, then the building must be maintained as an emergency shelter for 10 years. In all other cases where ESG funds are used that do not meet the criteria that I just went through, the building must be maintained as an emergency shelter for 3 years. The period of use begins on the date that the building is first occupied by a homeless household after the rehab or conversion is completed. Reasonable value is generally something that's going to be determined by an independent appraiser. The minimum periods of use apply even if ESG funding is no longer received by the agency. So that's a really important note. If any of these activities are carried out on a building, and then you don't receive ESG funding in the near future, this minimum period of use still applies. Okay, so shelter operations. These are what you find under shelter operations. So you have, oh wait, I'm sorry, this is your slide, Gordon. I apologize. Pass it back to you, Gordon.
That's all right. I think we all love shelter operations. I understand why someone would want that slide. So let's talk about shelter operations. So these are the things that are available under shelter operations. I'm not going to list them all off. They're on the slide that's in front of you. There are a lot of them, but some of them do bear additional explanation. We're going to detail those on the following slides. Next slide, please. So as a general note, under shelter operations, costs are eligible only insofar as they relate to the shelter. The example on the screen is that you can't buy furniture for participants to take with when they move into housing. And that's kind of the low hanging fruit of that explanation, right? You can buy furniture, but you can't do it. You can't gift furniture to participants to leave the shelter with. The other thing that I would say about that is that there is sometimes a continuum that exists between, is a person experiencing sheltered homelessness or unsheltered homelessness? And generally speaking, though we're talking about operations, it really comes back to all of it, that shelter operations is intended to provide for people who are experiencing sheltered homelessness or people who are applying to live in a shelter or receive shelter services through the shelter, not to folks who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness who may, for example, stop by the shelter during the day. So there's a nuance there to that I wanted to uplift. So in terms of maintenance, it includes minor and routine repairs, but it excludes more significant repairs and upgrades, which are covered under renovation. Generally speaking, the rule of thumb that I have used and heard repeated back to me from other communities is that if it's small or if it involves maintenance, then or rather upkeeping something that exists, it's maintenance. If it's larger or if it involves replacing something whole scale, like a large appliance or carpet or furniture or cabinets, then you may be getting into renovation. Next slide, please. For shelter supplies, it's defined in the interim rule as supplies necessary to the operation of the emergency shelter. It's a broad definition, and it can include a lot of different things. Everything from the pens needed on your sign-in sheet to the necessary items for maintaining a bathroom, and so on and so on and so on. This is a really good place whenever you get into something that's in-specific like this. For notes to file or policies and procedures that define what necessary is, so that when your costs are reviewed by HCD or by HUD, you have a clear explanation in the file of why you perceived a cost to be necessary to the operation of the shelter. For hotel motel vouchers, as I said earlier, they are an eligible cost under shelter, but only when no other appropriate shelter is available or accessible. And so this again is a really good place for a note to file. You're going to want to demonstrate that you did your due diligence to identify that there was no available and accessible shelter before you issue a hotel motel voucher. Remember also that this is a place where 2 CFR 200, sometimes called the Omni Circular, which is the uniform administrative requirements for costs under federal grants. The requirement under that is basically that all costs must be reasonable, allowable, and allocable. This is a great place to make sure that your hotel motel vouchers meet reasonable, allowable, and allocable, that you're not, for example, purchasing a stay at a luxury resort with ESG emergency shelter under most circumstances. Next slide, please. Under the Uniform Relocation Assistance and Real Property Acquisition Policies Act of 1970, usually called the URA, there are costs available under emergency shelter. It involves relocation payments and other assistance to people who are displaced by a project who are being assisted with ESG funds. People receiving URA assistance are not considered ESG program participants, which has implications on everything from data collection to reporting. Relocation and other URA assistance is not considered rental assistance or housing relocation and stabilization services. It's a complicated topic. We gloss over it here because it's also relatively uncommon compared to other ESG ES costs. It's a good place to review the interim rule and other associated materials. Next slide. Back over to you, Mike.
Thank you. So as promised, we will now get into waivers and alternative requirements for emergency shelter. So the applicability of this, when we talk about these waivers and flexibilities, we are really talking about ESG CV, and we are talking about annual ESG funds from federal fiscal year 2020 and prior when they are used for COVID response specifically. So those are the two cases in which these would be applicable. The first one, and this is a big one, is expanded eligibility. So HUD did change the eligibility for emergency shelter slightly for these funds. So category 1 was expanded as we have put below. An individual may qualify as homeless under category 1 when exiting an institution where they resided for 120 days or less instead of the usual 90 days or less. So they extended that time period because they found that people were staying in institutions longer associated with the pandemic. So you've got that extra time there for someone exiting an institution, but all the other qualifying factors remain the same. So the person still had to be literally homeless before entering that institution in order to qualify here. Can I ask everyone to mute, please? Thank you. Another important one here is that the match requirement is waived. For those who might have received annual ESG in the past, you would know that the match requirement is 100%. That is a heavy match requirement. Under these circumstances where these waivers are applicable, the match requirement is completely waived. For program income, this is not one that we see with shelter very often, if at all, especially not in a best practice model, but I am going to go through it anyway because it was specifically waived. So costs that are incidental to generating program income and not charged to the grant or subgrant can be deducted from the gross income to determine program income. It may be treated as an addition to the recipient or subrecipient's grant. Otherwise, it must be deducted from allowable costs as provided by the federal cost principles. This waiver for program income was really just designed to play side by side with the match requirement or the match waiver. So it just sort of corrects some inconsistencies in the regulatory language that tie back to match. But again, with emergency shelter, we would not expect to see this very often anyway. Just be aware that it exists as a waiver. And then low barrier assistance. The waivers specifically state that individuals and families experiencing homelessness may not be required to receive treatment or perform any other prerequisite activities as a condition for receiving shelter, rental assistance, or other services for these funds when they are used to respond to the pandemic. I will note here that it is also a best practice to do this in all emergency shelter. HUD has been putting that out there as a strong message for a long time. They put it in writing associated with these waivers, especially during the pandemic when we did not want to create barriers for people receiving shelter when they needed it. And back to you, Gordon, to talk about temporary emergency shelter.
All right, thank you. So temporary emergency shelter is shelter used for a limited time to provide shelter for crisis response. So eligible costs under that kind of emergency shelter are leasing, acquisition not to exceed $2.5 million per property, the renovation of real property into temporary emergency shelter, operating costs, essential services, health search and housing search and placement, housing search and counseling, and other costs that HUD pre-approves in writing. Temporary emergency shelter is exempt from minimum ESG shelter standards, though lead-based paint requirements do still apply, environmental review, and minimum periods of use, though acquisition and major rehab are still subject to the use and disposition requirements. Next slide, please. On the subject of converting temporary emergency shelter to sort of full emergency shelter, recipients and subrecipients may convert a TES acquired or improved with ESG-CV funds into emergency shelter as defined under the ESG interim rule without triggering the disposition requirements in 2 CFR 200-311C, meaning basically that you can convert temporary emergency shelter into sort of traditional ESG emergency shelter without triggering a set of requirements around what you have to do when you change, get rid of, dispose, or otherwise transfer property. When it becomes necessary or impractical to use the property as either temporary emergency shelter or emergency shelter as defined in the relevant ESG-CV notice, the owner of the property must obtain disposition instructions from HUD, which is outlined in 2 CFR 200. Next slide, please. Additional eligible activities include volunteer incentives for necessary COVID-19 relief services, hazard pay for people who are providing direct COVID-19 relief services to participants, training to direct staff on infectious disease prevention and mitigation, cell phones and internet for program participants while in the ESG program, Personal protective equipment, or PPE, for program participants. Note that it is not for staff. And finally, vaccine incentives, up to $50 per participant per dose when no other incentives are available. Some conditions and restrictions may apply to these additional eligible activities, and full details can be found in the relevant COVID-19 notices that are listed at the bottom of this slide. Next slide, please. Other requirements and best practices. Next slide. So requirements. The age of a child under the age of 18 must not be used as the basis for denying admission to shelter if that shelter provides family shelter. When ESG funds are used solely for essential services or operations, services or shelter must be provided for at least the period during which ESG funds are provided. If the subrecipient is a unit of general local government, general purpose local government, an UGLUG, ESG cannot replace local funds used for the same purpose that were provided during the preceding 12 months unless HUD determines that the UGLUG is in a severe financial deficit, which means effectively that if you fund, if a subrecipient that is an UGLUG that is funding shelter using ESG, using local funds, it can't take the local money out and put ESG in without a 12-month gap between them. It's intended to stop ESG displacing local funds. Other requirements like minimum period of use for renovation are described elsewhere in this presentation. Next slide, please. The equal access rule. The equal access rule, generally speaking, is about ensuring that people of all genders, regardless of family size or composition, have equal access to ESG funded programs. ESG funded emergency shelter is subject to the equal access rule the same way that other ESG funded projects are. They must have written policies regarding equal access rule implementation. Shelters that serve any families, so any households that have more than one person in them, must serve all families, regardless of any family member's gender. There are limited exceptions to this, but they are very limited, and they address, for example, shelters with certain kinds of group-only accommodations, like big group showers. And we really are talking about like a shower room that is a large square. No privacy is afforded to anyone anywhere. That's the level of exception we're talking about. Shelters that serve exclusively singles, so exclusively one-person households, no families whatsoever, may choose to serve a single gender, though they may not choose to serve a set of limited genders. So singles only shelters may choose to serve only women, for example, but they can't choose to serve only women and only men. There are other genders. And so if you are serving more than one gender, you have to serve everybody. If you're serving any families at all, you have to serve everybody, regardless of gender. If you're serving only singles, you may choose to serve only one gender. Single gender shelters can only use participant gender identity as eligibility criteria. They cannot use, for example, a participant's biological sex as they identify it, as it's identified on their driver's license or on their birth certificate. They cannot use intake worker perception of a participant's gender or sex, or anything else other than how a participant identifies their gender identity at intake to determine whether a participant meets the single gender criteria for the shelter. Finally, households that present as families must be served as families. Relationship type cannot be used as an eligibility criterion. And what we mean by that is a family is a family is a family is a family is a family. A group of people who show up and say we're a family is a family, and you serve them as a family. It doesn't matter if they're married. It doesn't matter if they're blood related. It doesn't matter if they have no legal relationship whatsoever. A family is a family is a family. Next slide, please. Best practices, sort of highlights of that. An emergency shelter that's implemented best practices is going to be client oriented, people first oriented, strength oriented, and in my opinion, really the most important of the four to hammer home, housing oriented. Its services are oriented around moving people rapidly into housing. Next slide, please. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you. So we will get into some specifics of those best practices elements that Gordon just went through. I will note there's going to be a little bit of repetition as we go through these, but that is on purpose because some of these are very important points and we want to make sure that we drive those home. So housing first is one of the foundational elements of best practices. That means an immediate focus on safe, stable housing tonight or as soon as possible. It means that your shelter will be low barrier, which includes no treatment, sobriety, or ID requirements or anything of that nature, and housing focused case management. So that's case management designed to get people on track for a permanent housing solution. We will be providing a little more detail on what some of those things mean as we go through this. Emergency shelter space. So when possible, it's ideal to have individual units, storage for personal belongings, accommodations for partners and pets. I believe we heard there's some funding in California for pets, and I believe that's a really important thing because I've given this example in previous presentations. If I had to go to a shelter, but they told me I couldn't bring my dog, I would not go to the shelter. I would prefer to sleep outside with my dog. So that's a really important one in my opinion. Maintenance and upkeep. So shelters should be livable, right? They must, of course, meet the minimum ESG standards, but they should be kept in a decent livable condition for the people who are going to be there. Staff readiness and support. So staff should have onboarding and ongoing training, which should define core competencies. There should be an expectation about what staff members know and what they are able to do in association with their job descriptions. They should be trained in crisis response, and there should be a culture of crisis response and resolution in the shelter. And then staff should be well versed in dealing with secondary trauma, which means, that the people, homelessness inflicts trauma, and staff will also experience trauma from dealing with homelessness. That's the secondary trauma. So you want staff to have the tools and resources to be able to deal with that. Under essential services and partnerships, on-site healthcare, screening, access and services, care coordination, facilitating access to legal workforce, childcare, and other needed services when they're not provided directly by the shelter. So if you don't receive the funding or don't have the capacity to provide those directly, having those connections to get these services is a best practice. And then progressive engagement and assistance. So safe and fail-safe shelter spaces, progressive program and system engagement. So that's, providing what a participant needs at the moment and then engaging in greater ways as that engagement is needed. Case conferencing and honoring and supporting participant choice. I'm going to dwell on that one for a second too. Participant choice is incredibly important. People in shelter still have autonomy. They still have the ability to make choices for themselves, and that choice needs to be respected. We know that not everything on here is going to be available to every shelter. Like for the space issue, for instance, like your physical setup of your building is going to determine some of that. So we're pointing out best practices here that shelters would follow to the greatest extent possible. So under housing first. One thing that's really important here is around rules. So rules for people who are staying in the shelter. Rules should be based on behavior and not on things that can be more subjective. So for example, you may prohibit unsafe or violent behaviors, but it would not be a best practice under Housing First to prohibit something that is more subjective like intoxication. I dwell on this one for a moment because I think it's really important in terms of best practice, and the idea of prohibiting intoxication is one that really hits home with me. I used to work with a shelter in the community that I worked with they breathalyzed everyone coming into the shelter, both when they came in for intake and when they returned after being outside of the shelter for the day. And people would get kicked out because they failed a breathalyzer test. The problem there is, you're doing this for the shelter, right? I am fortunate enough to have housing. When I come back home to my housing, I can drink as much as I want. And as long as I don't drive my car or do something else illegal or harm someone, there's no consequence for that, right? So I have not done a behavior that causes me to be in any peril, hopefully. However, we're imposing a different standard on people entering a shelter when we screen them for intoxication. And that's the core issue. We're imposing a different standard. So I dwell on that one because that's one that I have seen in practice force people to stay on the street when they could have been sheltered otherwise. So focus the program on helping participants find housing. That's really important. We want things to be housing focused in the homeless services system. And when they do find housing, celebrate success. We had a national agency do a large training for us in the state where I worked with emergency shelters. And one of the things they had those shelters do was create things to put on their walls, like actual visuals to show when people were moving into permanent housing. And that's really important because it helps the shelter staff visually see their success, and it helps the people in the shelter see what's happening with those who have been in their position. They're getting into permanent housing. That's really important. Ensure that participants are provided access to services. So you want to have links to case management, health, educational, and other services. Like we had mentioned before, shelters can't always provide all those directly, but having links to them when you can't provide them directly is a best practice. Services should be voluntary. That's another really important best practice point I want to hit on. They should not be required. They should be voluntary. And they should not be one size fits all. There shouldn't be a cookie cutter approach to providing services. It should be based on the individual's needs and their choice to participate in those services. And then finally, train staff in best practices. Best practices that we like to see staff trained in include, but are of course not limited to, things like trauma-informed care, harm reduction, motivational interviewing, mental health, and then links to housing. And you can even do community-specific training for links to housing to make sure that staff is aware of all the housing options available locally for people in the shelter. So best practices around participant engagement. Ensure that clients understand the program and the expectations. Clients should be very clear about expectations when they enter the shelter, and they should not be surprised by things. The intake or participant agreement package should provide clear guidance towards that end. Ensure that clients understand the termination and grievance policy. I will dwell on that one for a second too. You're required to have a grievance policy, but it should be very clearly communicated to a client that if they have an issue with the program that causes a grievance, or if they are terminated from the program for any reason, that there is a process that they can go through related to that, and they need to understand that clearly. And then base engagement on the client's ability to engage, offer choices and a trauma-informed perspective, and understand, again, back to client choice, that they have the autonomy to decide how they engage with the program and the services, and they need to be afforded that autonomy. And then finally, best practices around rules. I know we've talked about this a little before, but I want to circle back to it because, again, I've seen this in practice. I think it's really important to understand how rules work in shelters. The rules should be focused on health and safety and not on creating barriers or conflict. And it is absolutely possible for an emergency shelter's rules to create barriers to getting into permanent housing solutions, to create barriers to being in the shelter itself, and to cause conflict. We do not want that. We want rules to be focused on behaviors that facilitate health and safety. Rules and policies should be designed to promote success, not failure. If you have a book that is 50 pages thick and it's all rules and there's a million opportunities for someone to mess up, but you're not facilitating their move into permanent housing because they're spending all day trying to follow all of the rules, that is not setting them up for success, right? So we want to avoid that. Rules should be specific. So for example, you might say that privacy will be respected, but staff may enter and inspect your room once per week on Tuesdays, or when there is a cause to believe a health or safety concern exists. So what you're doing with that example is being really specific. This is when we are going to enter your room. This is when we do inspections. And that's important because, again, it goes back to a person's autonomy and their right to privacy. So this is telling them exactly when you'll be in their room. It can create conflict, and I have seen this in shelters too, when they just decide to go in a person's individual unit whenever they want and do inspections. It can create conflict, it can create dangerous situations sometimes. So you want your rules around things like that to be specific so that clients understand exactly what's going to happen, when it's going to happen, and it's communicated clearly. And then finally, along those same lines, rules or the shelter should explain how things work with the rules really clearly. So if there's a rule around when or how meals are served or how to ask for help, any quiet hours, trash pickup, etc., things like that. So procedural rules, right? We're not talking about the behavioral rules now. We're just talking about rules that are designed to facilitate shelter operations. Those just need to be communicated clearly so that, again, people know what to expect. They're not surprised by anything, and they don't end up in violation of a random rule simply because they didn't know about it. And I will now turn it back to Gordon to cover housing-focused practices.
All right, thank you. There's been some of this in the chat, but I'm glad that we're uplifting it onto the screen right here. Emergency shelter at its core, and this is really at the root of everything that we've been saying the entire time. The point of emergency shelter is to take someone who is experiencing homelessness and get them back to housing as quickly as possible, using emergency shelter as a platform for that to happen. Right? Housing has to be safe and stable, but the goal is to take someone from homelessness and return them to housing, period. And so this housing focus is really about getting people out of shelter as quickly as possible, rather than retaining them in shelter to try and fix problems or behavioral elements that they may or may not want or need to have fixed in their lives. All services in shelter should be focused on exiting people to permanent housing as rapidly as possible. And again, we are talking about safe and stable housing. We know that there are a lot of DV service providers in the audience. And so when we say back to permanent housing, we always mean safe and stable. It's not about returning folks to an unsafe situation. A housing focus really means shifting your case management approach from what can I do to help you, which could be anything, right? It could be anything they think they need help with. It could be anything you think they need help with, to how can I help you obtain housing, right? Get back to housing and stabilize the housing, right? And finally, it's all about housing. It's not about healing. It's not about fixing. It's not about setting anything right or whatever your perspective on that is. It's about homelessness to housing as fast as you can go. Next slide, please. In terms of practically implementing the things that we just talked about, at intake, you should really begin from a housing plan, developing a housing plan as soon as a participant is able to do that. And it should be like day one, really, absent emergent health issues, really. You should be able to immediately start working on a housing plan. And that housing plan needs to incorporate identifying the barriers to tenancy that the participant is going to need to work through to get back to housing. It should involve connecting the participant to housing resources that are housing focused, and that can be everything from coordinated entry access and applying to Section 8 to secondary resources like SSI, SSDI, if the participant qualifies for that or might qualify for that, to build up the income a participant needs to sustain rental. Focusing all of your meetings on getting back to permanent housing. So instead of having like, okay, we're going to do a weekly check-in and it's undirected, having these really focused sessions that are about, we can talk about XYZ, but tie all of them back to a housing barrier that is preventing a person from getting back to permanent housing, or tying it to a strength that will enable a person to circle back to permanent housing. Finally, housing plans need to be worked. They need to be reviewed and they need to be engaged. Ideally, you're going to do it at least once a week, which is going to sound like a lot if your existing shelter practice is like, all right, we keep people until they're really ready to go back to housing. This philosophy says everybody is ready to go back to housing. And conversely, nobody is ready to stay in shelter forever. And so your rhythm of activity needs to be acute, constant, specific, and at least weekly meetings ensures that both staff and participants are actively working toward participant returns to housing. Next slide, please.
The next slide is our intermission slide, but I want, if I could, I would love to take a moment to emphatically agree with something Gordon put in the chat around the idea of not trying to fix people. That is, I made that point in a previous version of this training, and it didn't occur to me going through this, but I really want to emphatically agree with that. You know, we see it a lot of times in shelter around things like service requirements. So if you're going to come into our shelter, you are going to do life skills training. You are going to do X, Y, Z. And a lot of times that is coming from the place of assumption that a person must be broken. They must have issues. There must be something wrong with them because here they are at our shelter. And that is a flawed assumption. It does not always apply. And, you know, assuming people have issues, I mean, sure, I have issues. Everyone has issues, but those do not have to mean that they have any bearing on the fact that you are showing up at that shelter. So the housing focus is the key, not trying to fix everything that is wrong in a person's life with any issues they might have, and not assuming that they even have issues. You know, it's all about assumptions, right? So all of that is just to say, I emphatically agree with what Gordon had to say there in the chat. I think it's a really important point when we talk about shelter services. I will get off my soapbox now, and I will move us on to the intermission slide.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks, Gordon, and thanks for the thoughtful things that have been put in the chat so far from folks. I really appreciate that. We are going to take our intermission. Following intermission, we'll do a lightning round and have a chance for question and answers. So if there's questions from the first section, or if questions arise during a lightning round, happy to entertain those at the end of the session. We're going to take a little bit longer break today. We've got 7 minutes until the top of the hour, the top of the noon hour in California. So we'll see you back here at 12 Pacific time.
All right, thank you. Get us moved forward here. Want to acknowledge really quickly too, I see Don's comment there in the chat. I'm gonna push that one to the end for when we have discussion, but you make some good points and I think they are relevant. I think we can certainly include that in the discussion. But for now, we are going to jump into our lightning round. So we will get into some questions and see what we have learned from the session. So question number 1. Which of the following people is not eligible for ESG funded emergency shelter? I'm not going to read all the options word for word. You can see them there on your screen. We've given you 4 options and you should have a poll popping up in a moment here. And there you go. So you've got choice 1, 2, 3, or 4. Which one of these do you think is not eligible for ESG funded emergency shelter? We'll give you about 20 seconds or so to drop an answer in, unless everyone is very enthusiastic and we get everyone's answer faster than that. Sometimes we do. I also want to point out not sure is always an option, and there is no shame in answering not sure if you don't know. This is all anonymous. We cannot tell who is answering what. So there is nothing to tie you to it. We don't know who you are in the answers. So feel free to throw a guess out there, answer not sure. In fact, when you're talking about federal programs, not sure is always a good answer, in my opinion, because they're complicated. Looks like we've got about 47% of everyone has provided an answer. I'll give you a few more seconds. But it does look like we have a pretty solid consensus on choice 4. A few answers for choice 3 and a few not sures. I think we've gotten as far as we're going to get with this one, maybe. We got up to 51, 53. It's pretty good. All right, so we're going to go, it looks like choice 4 was the consensus with the group. Let's go ahead and see what the right answer is. Category 1 homelessness does not include those staying in a hotel motel unless the stay is paid for by a charitable organization or government program. So those who chose choice 4 there, that is correct. People sleeping in public or private place not meant for human habitation, people staying in emergency shelter, and those fleeing domestic violence, including human trafficking, are eligible under categories 1 and 4. And now over to Gordon. Question 2.
All right, thank you. Which of the following is required when using a sign-in sheet to document homelessness at emergency shelter entry? Is it sign-in sheet includes a self-attestation of homelessness? Sign-in sheet is clearly posted at all physical shelter entry points. That sign-in sheets are destroyed once client data is entered into HMIS, or is it that sign-in sheets must contain the last four of a person's social security number, HMIS ID, or another unique identifier other than their name? The poll is now active. Go ahead and drop your answers in. As Mike said, your answers are anonymous, so go ahead and take a guess, but also not sure is always an okay answer. We've done a few of these presentations and I was laughing to myself because I was typing in the chat the whole time Mike was sort of putting boundaries around what we're doing. We can't see what you're saying, that not sure is an okay answer, that not sure is a common answer when it comes to federal programs. I had to keep deleting what I was writing because he was saying it about 3 seconds ahead of everything that was coming out of my fingers. So really, we've got it down to a science, but also I think all of us recognize that, that this is difficult, and this is really about a process of learning more than a process of demonstrating what you know. So looks like 27 responses in. Love to get a few more. What you think?
We appreciate everyone's participation. I agree with what Gordon just said. These questions are not like a test of knowledge. It's more just to help us drive the discussion forward. If there are things that we didn't present clearly or things that there are bigger issues around, we want to know that. And the questions are a fun way to figure it out.
That's exactly right. Well, that's 2/3 of everybody. Let's shut it on down. Choice number 1 was the most popular. That's the sign-in sheet has to include an attestation of homelessness, self-attestation of homelessness. Let's have a look at the answer. You are, of course, correct. To meet HUD's documentation requirements, the sign-in sheet must contain a self-certification of homelessness statement. There's no requirement that sign-in sheets be posted at each entrance, though that might be a good practice depending on the shelter layout. Sign-in sheets must be maintained in accordance with all applicable record-keeping requirements, and specific elements of the sign-in sheet are not defined by HUD, but should not create barriers to entering shelter. And so, for example, social security number, HMIS ID, et cetera, in theory might be program practices, but there you can see the way in which they might create a barrier. On to the next question. Back to you, Mike.
All right, question 3. If emergency shelter staff are unable to obtain third-party verification of homelessness for an individual seeking access, which of these options is the most reasonable and compliant action that they can take? So if they can't get third-party verification of homelessness, should they request that the person obtain third-party documentation before admitting them? Should they admit the person to the shelter using self-certification of homelessness? Should they require intake staff to make observations regarding the person's living situation? Or should they admit the person to the shelter but disallow access to ESG-funded services? Have a pretty strong response up front on that one. It's like we've got 25 people. Let's see if we can get a few more.
Loving the rapid response rate.
Yeah.
Knowledgeable and invested crowd. We love being here with y'all.
Yep. I think we've got a pretty solid consensus there on choice 2, admit the person using self-certification of homelessness. And that is, of course, correct. Lack of third-party documentation must never prevent immediate access to shelter per the ESG program interim rule. Shelter staff must not let absence of third-party documentation or absence of staff observations create barriers to shelter entry. Self-certification for emergency shelter is always allowable. Shelter staff can follow up with more detailed documentation as it becomes available, but it's important to note that if the person or household is fleeing domestic violence, shelter staff may only pursue more detailed documentation to the extent that it does not compromise the safety of the household. And back to you, Gordon.
All right. Question 4, true or false? Under legal services, as long as a given service is necessary to remove a housing barrier and performed by a licensed professional, it might be eligible. Is that true or false? Let's get that poll up and see what you think. Not sure remains an option. Not sure is always an option. True and false always a little easier. Answers are pouring in. Kind of narrows the field. Yeah, Christine, we're all awake and not AFK. That's a good point. I've always felt that there should be a way that I would really like Zoom to give us a way to like push coffee out to y'all, or tea, or other stimulating beverage of choice out to our participants, just to get everybody, you know, stimulated and in the mood for what we're delivering. So that's 2/3 everybody. Go ahead and close that poll. Overwhelmingly, y'all said it was true. Let's have a look. Unfortunately, it is false. Per the ESG program interim rule, legal services are restricted to certain topics. Specifically, legal services are eligible to address child custody and emancipation issues, DV protection and civil remedies, appeals of denial for veterans or mainstream benefits, and resolving outstanding criminal warrants. Legal services are only eligible to the extent that they address a housing barrier. And I want to linger on this for just a second. There is a strong temptation to apply logic and intuition to federal program rules. And when you hear us talk about things like case management and say like, this is broadly defined, or shelter operations supplies, like it's any supplies necessary to the shelter, there's a sense that like, okay, as long as we can justify this is necessary, it's fine. That's true in some cases, but in other cases, the eligible costs are very narrowly and specifically defined. And so while the intuitive response might be like, yeah, legal services should be eligible as long as the service is necessary to remove a housing barrier and performed by someone licensed to do it, that's simply not what's in the interim rule. And so there's always value in distinguishing between where there is wiggle room and where there isn't. And if you're not sure, referring back to the interim rule. Next slide.
Okay, question 5. Which of the following activities might not be eligible under transportation? So you'll want to think about circumstances here, but which of the following might not be eligible? Is it public transportation costs for participants, mileage allowances for staff transporting participants to essential services, a family serving shelter purchasing a vehicle to transport participants to and from childcare, or all of these are explicitly eligible under the ESG program interim rule? So tell us which of those might not be eligible. I will say this is a tricky one and written a little differently than some of our other questions.
I was just about to say, I felt the difficulty ratchet up from between questions.
You're doing pretty good though. We've got 25 responses. Maybe we'll see if we can get a few more. Going once, going twice. All right. Choice 4 was the consensus here, so all are explicitly eligible. Let's see. So they're not all explicitly eligible, and that's why this question was a little tricky. We didn't give you enough detail on public transportation costs for participants to really determine. So while public transportation costs are eligible under transportation, the costs can become ineligible if the transportation is not used to travel to and from employment or another eligible essential services location. So it's critically important to document both the purchase and use of items like bus passes, tokens, any kind of public transportation passes. So, you know, that's where we kind of made this a trick question. We just didn't give you enough detail. So if you give someone a bus pass so that they can go to a counseling session, for instance, that is eligible. If you give them that exact same bus pass, and to use Gordon's example from before, they use it to go to the water park, it is automatically not eligible anymore. So you just didn't have enough detail to answer the right way there. Sorry for the trick question. And on to the next one.
Yeah, you're lucky you got Mike for question 5. I would not have been sorry for the trick question. So which of the following is the core criterion for determining whether a given purchase of shelter supplies is eligible as an operating cost? Is it that whether they are exclusively given to participants to meet essential needs, whether they are necessary for the operation of the shelter, whether they meet the ESG program interim rules strict definition of supplies, or whether they are exclusively used by shelter staff and do not pass into participant hands. Which of these is the core criterion, the essential criterion, the base criterion for determining whether a given purchase of shelter supplies is eligible under operating? Yeah, I feel like we have one person in the audience who, when the polls pop up, immediately hits not sure, like as a protest vote, which I love.
I respect that.
Yeah, I do too. If there's somebody out there who's like, look, I've read the interim rule back to front, and my answer to all of these is not sure. You know what? I'm with it.
Yeah, me too.
And I think the water park example is funny because it's so clearly a manifestation of 100-degree days here in Louisiana.
It's also an interesting thing with things like bus passes, because you could give it to a participant for a specific use and they could not follow your instructions and use it for an entirely different thing. And that could determine whether it's eligible or not under ESG. So you can even lose some control under certain circumstances.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Well, we got shelter providers here. I think they're very familiar with the sensation of losing control.
Good point.
All right. All right. Well, that's about 60%. There's 60%. Let's call it. Choice 2 was the consensus. Folks thought the core criteria was whether they were necessary for the operation of the shelter. Let's have a look at the answer. You are, of course, absolutely correct. The core criteria is whether supplies are necessary for the operation of the shelter. The interim rule does not further define what constitutes supplies or what is necessary. As we said earlier, given the broad definition, this is a great place for strong documentation, either in your project policies and procedures and or in each specific expense to justify the necessity of that expense. Next slide, please.
Question 7. Is it allowable under the equal access rule for an emergency shelter to limit services exclusively to transgender singles and families? And then why is that the case? So your options are no, that is not allowable because all shelters must serve all people regardless of gender. No, it's not allowable because all shelters that serve any families must serve all people regardless of gender. Or on the flip side, yes, it is allowable because shelters have the discretion to serve either people of a single gender or people of all genders. Or finally, yes, it's allowable because sex and gender are protected classes. People whose gender is marginalized is an eligible subpopulation for shelters. So tell us if you think that serving transgender singles and families only is allowable and why.
This is my favorite question, and I'm glad to see it recurring. This is also the hardest question in this entire thing, in my opinion. So I'm very interested to see how it comes out.
Yeah, when the equal access rule really started rolling out back around 2016, training emergency shelters on that, especially in the place where I was working at the time, was very challenging.
Yeah.
We didn't understand all the nuances yet. The shelters certainly didn't understand, and many of them didn't want to hear those nuances. And it was a task,
Oh,
but
yeah.
it is incredibly important, and I'm glad we did it.
Yeah. Agreed. I did that twice, once in Wisconsin and once in Louisiana, and those were two incredibly hostile audiences when the equal access rule first came out, because it's such a significant shift to the way many shelters had traditionally done business and the way shelters were thinking about access. And it was very shelter specific.
Mhm.
I have a lot of homelessness prevention programs calling me all upset about the equal access rule. It was really a shelter thing.
Mhm.
Giving folks a little extra time on answers. It's taken a little extra time to get answers in, understandably, because if it's a difficult question, it's nuanced. But I gotta say, I'm gratified by the number of people who are engaging with it. It's an important question. It's not an obvious question. And it is one that increasingly all of our providers do need to be able to answer. All right, well, I think we've studied out around there, so let's go ahead and close it down. The answers were pretty equally divided. I think only choice number 4 did not have a strong backing. So let's just have a look at what the answer is and then talk it through. Mike, this is your question. Why don't you have the answer and talk it through?
I think you covered this one in every other presentation. So the answer is no. This would not be allowable, and it is because all shelters that serve families must serve all people regardless of gender. The marginalization of a given gender or genders does not change the requirements of the equal access rule. While it's acceptable for a shelter or housing program to limit assistance to households with children, it may not limit assistance to women or another limited set of genders with children. So such a shelter or housing program must also serve single adult or multi-adult families with children, regardless of the adult's sexual orientation, marital status, or gender identity. I know something you pointed out on this before, Gordon, is it seems a little counterintuitive because in this instance, you're trying to serve a population that is traditionally marginalized. So you're looking specifically at transgender singles. And you would think, you would hope that there would be a way to make it easier to provide services to that population, but the way the equal access rule is written, this isn't compliant with it. And that is how the equal access rule plays out in this situation. And we will move on to question 8.
Thank you. I just want to say I was going to surface exactly what you just said, Mike, that this is that ruling feels counterintuitive, and to those of us who care strongly about equal access for people of all genders, it can feel crummy, right? It feels crummy. But it helps if you remember the reason that answer is the way it is that transgender is not a gender, right? It is a description of a set of genders as opposed to a gender in and of itself. But then that's what helps me get to a yes on that one. Anyway, question 8, which of the following is not an appropriate focus area for a best practice emergency shelter, which is not an appropriate focus area? Is it a people-first orientation, strengths-based orientation, housing orientation, or recovery orientation? Which of these is not appropriate as a focus area? Not appropriate. And the phone lines are lighting up. It's just one phone line, really, it's lighting up. Sometimes I think these quiet moments between questions where people are answering, it's good to give just a little bit of quietude to everybody to digest like a previously complicated question, grapple with the question on screen.
I agree.
Like the credits after a movie. Sit back and decompress from what you've experienced. All right, well, that's about 60%. Let's go ahead and shut that down. Overwhelmingly, folks said for the recovery orientation is not appropriate. Let's have a look at the answer. You are, of course, correct. Recovery services for clients who choose them are best delivered in a permanent housing setting, not an emergency shelter. That is a cornerstone of the Housing First service delivery model, which says fundamentally that housing, it's not housing only, it's not exclusively housing, it's that people have a tendency, a strong tendency, to get everything else sorted out in their life once you take care of housing first and then everything else. But the housing piece is the first piece. Next question.
Okay. Question 9. Which of the following is the best answer to which shelter participants are the most appropriate candidates for diversion and rapid exit. I want to acknowledge we didn't go through this in a whole lot of detail, but as we mentioned, these questions are kind of a way for us to gauge what's going on out there in the community and see what the knowledge level around some of these practices is. So we're just going to ask you, diversion from shelter and rapid exit from shelter. Which shelter participants do you think would be the most appropriate candidates for diversion and rapid exit? So would that be participants who have not yet entered shelter, participants who have not yet entered and who have just entered shelter, participants who have not yet entered shelter, have just entered shelter, and have been in shelter for a little while, participants at every stage of shelter engagement, even people who have been in shelter for a long time. Again, it is perfectly fine to say not sure. This is these are drawn from a concept known as housing problem solving, which Gordon has been doing a lot of work around lately and which we've been presenting in various different venues. It's something that's been around for a while, but it's only really starting to be named and put out there in communities as a specific thing, and the funding around it isn't totally figured out. So just want to point out it is something new, and we are trying to gauge what's going on out there. I'll give everyone a moment to see if we have more answers. Strong not sure contingent, and that is perfectly okay. Still very good participation though. We've got 24 responses.
It's a heavily caffeinated group of people, even if we can't put the caffeine through the screen.
I think we've probably hit what we're going to hit with that one, so we can close it out. It looks like we've got an even split between choice 4 and not sure. So let's take a look at the answer. The answer is choice 4. The best answer is people at every stage of shelter engagement. While housing problem solving approaches are statistically most likely to be effective at first touch, they do continue to be effective even for people with long shelter stays. So as you start hearing more about housing problem solving, that is just something to keep in the back of your mind around your shelter operations. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Gordon.
You did a great job. I think the only thing that I would add is that housing problem solving is very inexpensive compared to a permanent housing subsidy. And so while it seems counterintuitive to keep trying a strategy with a low rate of success with people who have been in shelter for a long time, it makes a lot of sense when you realize that if you're successful, even with 5% of the people that you are engaging, it is roughly as expensive to do that as to provide a permanent housing subsidy. And you don't need to go find another permanent housing subsidy. And you don't need to go find a unit for folks to rent. And folks have a tendency not to need a second year of assistance. The assistance ends when the folks return to housing. And so there's a lot of value in providing that long tail of housing problem solving case management.
Okay, and I will let you talk us through some resources, and that will be the end.
Okay, on your screen are a set of resources for your reference. Of course, we've got the interim rule. The HUD ESG virtual binder provides training on lots of subjects related to ESG, including emergency shelter. We've got the link to the ESG waivers, notices, and flexibilities, as well as a summary of those. And finally, there is a learning series provided by the National Alliance to End Homelessness around emergency shelter that is very much worth the time to have a look, which I think brings us to Q&A. So I will pass it back to our charming host.
Thank you, Gordon. Thank you, Mike. Thank you all of you for sticking with us through that lightning round. I know it's a really good way for us to, ask real life practical questions that you might be asking to put our learning today into practice. We have a statement from Don that I'm going to kind of walk us through and have you both react to. A question from Seamus, and then honestly, anyone who wants to come on video, talk to us, ask us questions, start a conversation, we would welcome that. So Mike, go ahead. You can take those slides down. We are good for the rest of this afternoon. So I'm going to start with Mike's and start with Don's first. Gordon, you bring up that this is all about housing, this being emergency shelter, it's all about housing, but we also understand if we don't address other issues in a holistic approach, then the chances of our clients successfully retaining the housing goes down as well. We also risk losing landlords who are willing to work with us. And if we have too many folks with issues after they have been successfully housed. Just some thoughts on housing retention in an extremely tight competitive housing market, which is extremely common in the state of California. So thoughts on that?
I certainly do have some thoughts on that. Don, I fundamentally don't disagree with what you're saying there. It is, emergency shelter is fundamentally about getting people back to safe, stable, permanent housing. And what you're really talking about is how to get folks into stable, permanent housing, right? How to stabilize them in permanent housing. And so, I agree with your fundamental premise that like there are often issues that you need to address with participants before they're going to be able to say yes to housing or before they're going to succeed in housing. And that if you move a participant into a unit before they have those sort of foundational elements, that you can put your relationships with landlords at risk, or that they might risk losing housing. All of those are perfectly good points. And I really agree with them. What we're trying to caution against is that that's kind of a slippery slope, right? That you really are in a position when you're serving someone through emergency shelter where you're trying to identify what their actual housing barriers are. And that's what we're trying to hit on, is there's a difference between a participant lacks certain life skills, that the absence of those skills will mean that they will trash their apartment, or that they will be unable to feed themselves successfully, or that they don't have basic cleaning techniques. And the absence of those skills will mean that they do not achieve stable housing. And those are that's absolutely a housing barrier that's completely appropriate to address. But that's different from saying everybody needs to be sober before they get into housing. That's just not true. Like, I will give you the following two examples from my time in the field, just to illustrate the difference between clients. And so I used to run a permanent supportive housing program, a rapid rehousing program, and a transitional living program. I had one PSH client we served for 6 years. I met with this person once a year for 5 years. She had a severe and persistent mental illness, and she was in a position where she, on paper, should not have been able to maintain stable, permanent housing due to the way that her mental illness expressed itself, and the way in which she managed it with medication that was not prescribed, and an orientation in shelter that said like, oh, we got to deal with the substance problem before we move you into housing, would have kept her in shelter for longer than she needed to be. She was very successful. She was one of our most stable participants. By the time I left that organization, she was still great. She's doing great. Conversely, we had a family in shelter who checked all of the boxes. Honestly, they could have been on a sitcom from the 60s. They were like a nuclear family, and they were like picture perfect, and you could see a picket fence when you looked at them. And we moved them into this beautiful single family home that had like a fireplace and 2 stories and a chandelier. And it was this weird, like perfect situation. And they burned down the kitchen. And there's nothing in their background that would have indicated that that would have gone wrong, and no way to prep for it. And so I think what I would put out there ultimately is that as a shelter operator, you're always balancing like, what are the housing barriers we can identify, and what are actual barriers versus like things a person needs to work on to maintain long-term stability. What do we need to eliminate now to make sure that the person's likely to get into and stay in housing, versus what is really a housing intervention that folks put into practice later. And that's difficult. It's always specific to the client, and it requires it requires the magic touch of a case manager at the end of the day. But it is always oriented around getting someone from shelter into housing.
Mike, anything to add to that before we go to our next question?
I think that's a really good run through of it. I think I would just say I agree. I think there is absolutely a place for that holistic approach. And there's absolutely there are absolutely things that may need to be addressed before a person is put in that permanent housing, but it is all very dependent upon the person, and it's very dependent upon their choices, and it's very dependent upon their specific barriers. So yeah, I agree with all of what Gordon just said.
Thanks. I'm gonna go out of order because we have some stuff going on in the chat that I want to continue this. And Luis added some stuff that I think is also valuable just to kind of talk through. This is one of those sticky issues where housing first and coordinated entry system rules about placing the most vulnerable individual. Wow, that was a real word I messed up. Vulnerable individuals and families first start to conflict. We cannot require ready to rent that would help under housing first. Volunteer participation does not let us require the individuals engage in life skills trainings that would actually help them. And that's part of that kind of conversation we just had. Anything that to add there based on what Louisa just said?
Yeah, I want to get my pithy answer in, and then I want to turn it over to Mike, who clearly has good thoughts. I guess my immediate response to that is, who decides whether someone is ready to rent? Mike, I'm sure you have things you want to add on top of that.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of how to put it best. Like, it's that because it is a very dynamic situation. But I think the point you just made is very relevant. Like, who decides ready to rent? And if we're thinking about something that would benefit a client, how are we defining what would benefit the client? And I am certainly not discounting that there are case managers who know their clients incredibly well, and they can read the writing on the wall, and they know what that client is going to need. That absolutely is the case. I have also seen shelters where there were case managers who thought that things would benefit clients that maybe were not the most beneficial things, but it was just their process. Everyone who comes through our door needs, X training or X service. And so they just did it for everyone because it was going to be beneficial. And there was no real thought behind why it was going to be beneficial or why this specific person or household or family needs it. So that's really, I think, what it comes back around to. It's about the case manager's relationships with their clients, which admittedly, those relationships look different in a shelter or a street outreach setting than they do in like a rapid rehousing or a homelessness prevention setting. They're very different. And I think all of that comes into play. So that's a really long-winded way of saying I think it's a dynamic thing. And I think all of that has to be taken into consideration. So we're really just thinking about operating in best practice while realizing that it's dynamic.
And the way I've always thought about this, and it's been clear to me living in a large city for the last few years and seeing folks on the street and seeing folks in shelter and just kind of interacting with folks that, we have preconceived assumptions or judgments or notions about folks and why they're where they are. And ultimately, we just don't know. Even if we ask, we might not get the right answer. And leading with compassion, leading with openness, and knowing that a lot of folks that live in houses are not sober. A lot of folks who live in houses do lots of things they shouldn't do, but they're still there. There's more to it than a drug addiction. There's more to it than a mental illness. We have to look at the picture as a whole, and everyone should have housing. So I'm going to leave that thread there. I'm going to go back to Seamus's question since we kind of got through most of that. This is a concrete question that I think we can answer pretty straightforward. Seamus wants to know, can we have an example of a statement for an emergency shelter sign and seek to self-certify homelessness? I think we kind of had that on one slide, but if one of you could just kind of give us an idea of what you would put on top of that to meet HUD's expectations, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, there's not really a template or like a HUD approved statement along those lines, but it really just has to be, I think, a statement that basically restates the eligibility criteria under category 1. So, I hereby certify that I am staying in a place not meant for human habitation. I have no additional support networks and don't have the resources to obtain housing as of right now. And if the person signs that all of that is true, then they qualify under self-certification.
It's basically reiterating the category 1 definition. Mike, is that what I heard you just say?
Yeah.
Gordon, is that where you were headed as well?
I think the only thing I would add is if you're looking for specific language, somebody in your COC, either at the COC level or at the provider level, already has a self-certification of homelessness that they're using on a person-to-person basis. Just lift the top of it off and stick it on a sign-on sheet, and you're good to go.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Gordon. Thank you, Seamus, for that question. Oh my gosh, what is this? Louisa, Luis, I don't know why I keep putting A in the end of your name, Luis. I know your name. If you would like to come off, I see you've got plenty to say. We'd love to continue the conversation, but it is getting too long for me to read. I'm sorry.
Haha, it does. Okay, so you say Louisa because my email is Louise A. That's why. No, I guess this is where I understand exactly why each one of these things were put into place. You know, coordinated entry was put into place so that you couldn't just accept people who were, you know, the best on paper and the most likely to succeed and the least likely to cause troubles with the landlords. And I understand why housing first was necessary, because requiring breathalyzers just to get into a shelter is definitely a big obstacle. So I understand all of that. And I also understand why voluntary participation is important, because people were setting up all sorts of crazy rules and hoops that people had to jump over. However, when you put all three of them together, sometimes they become a poison pill, because sometimes they conflict with each other. Like under housing first, we can't require that everyone who wants to apply to housing take ready to rent. Yet people in our community who are not funded by federal funds exactly do require ready to rent. So if we want them to be able to access not just federally funded programs that do not require it, but other resources in the community, then we have to make sure that people do follow ready to rent. And it does help them, you know, that has measurable outcomes in terms of making people more successful, but we can only do it if they want to. And we can't deny them housing under voluntary participation for failing to do ready to rent classes. So some of these things really they just make it difficult even when we are so well-meaning and as inclusive as we possibly can be. And I've seen people overcome some incredibly hard obstacles that you would have thought, oh my goodness, if we can just get them to a housing choice voucher or some sort of permanent supportive housing, we'll be happy, right? Like to keep them stable. And yet they've overcome everything and gone on to be completely independent. And yes, we've had other people who seem like they'll be okay and trash places and wreck landlord relationships. So yeah, that's just kind of my input, because, you know, we try really hard to lead with heart and compassion and still remain compliant, but there's so many places that will lead us to be uncompliant if we're trying to do right.
Yeah, and I think my reaction back to you, Luis, is this is what it is like to serve human beings. None of us are simple. None of us are analog. We're all very dynamic, and there are certainly things I've done in rental housing that, as a landlord, I would not have liked. There are certainly things I now, as a homeowner, I wouldn't do in my own home, and you know, I think the idea of offering the ready rent classes, because it opens up more housing options, is a perfect way to open the door for folks.
Okay.
But they still have the opportunity to say yes or no. We all are independent, and we can make our own choices in life. But offering it in that way, like if you take this, I have 3 more options I might be able to provide you down the road. Those are good ways to get folks to say yes to things that are actually going to benefit them that they may not really be interested in. Where the reverse is saying, I'm not going to even bother trying to help you find housing if you don't go through this regular path. That, of course, leads to a lot worse outcomes, I think, with clients, at least in my experience, which is, trust me, a long time ago. So I'm talking, you know, way back in my experience. But I do see when you put all 3 things together, you know, housing first, you put together core entry, you put together client choice. There are things in there that are not smooth, and that is the problem of creating a system around humans. Gordon, I see you off chat. I think you have something to say as well.
Yeah. I think what I would add to that ultimately, Louise, you can please correct me if I'm wrong, but what I think based on what you're putting in the chat and what I think I'm hearing from you, is that I think you're a little locked into this is HUD's model of doing things, and so we're going to do things the HUD way in this specific way track. And it's a good track. Like, there's nobody who believes in coordinated entry more than I do. Like, really, actually, there might not be anybody who believes in coordinated entry and its value more than I do. But I think the reality is that, like, oh, coordinated entry prioritization works this way, and so we have to design all of our services around coordinated entry simply isn't true. And it's demonstrably not true because Section 8 and EHV vouchers are so prevalent and valuable and important to our population served. But there are so many different routes to housing. Housing problem solving is one of them, and non-HUD vouchers, and HUD but not COC or ESG vouchers are one of them. Like, not worrying so much about like, oh God, is this gonna like kick them off the coordinated entry list? Like, that's just one way back to housing. The flip side of that is I think what Chris was getting at, and I want to restate it in a way that works for my brain, which is not better or worse, but is just the way that I would think about it, is that like, I as a human always want my system that I design to work 100% of the time for 100% of people. And no matter what rules are in place, no matter how forward thinking they are, these systems are just not going to produce 100% success rate. Not in the timeline that we want, not for all the people that we want. And so the goal is to design not the best system or the perfect system, but a better system that works most of the time. And that's what I think happens there. And if you're recognizing that there are marginal cases where like, yeah, the person is in shelter, but they don't want to do anything. Like they just want to live in shelter forever. And that's the choice that they seem to be making. Like, yeah, that is a choice people can make. And it really sucks for your project outcomes. And it's not good for the person. And you don't want that for them. But I've yet to see the system where there aren't a couple of people doing that. And the way out of that is not to worry about what the requirements are, but to focus on like strength-based case management. That's motivational interviewing is where that comes in. Again, the magic case management touch. And I know that I'm preaching to the choir. So.
And yeah, I mean, our staff does that. They take motivational interviewing training. Of course, as a victim service provider, everything is trauma informed, and Lord knows there's a lot of trauma around, around housing with it. I just think sometimes our staff feels like if they're going to get dinged, and if we're going to possibly lose funding because our outcomes weren't good because we really did right and we're compliant, then we risk losing funding. If we do what we need to make our program outcomes good, then it means you might be not serving the people the way you should be. So I don't feel like we are bound by the rules, and we certainly do. I mean, we play hard and heavy with all resources available to clients, and if we are not the best option with our housing program, we will try to find other options for them. But I do know that it wears on our staff. We've had people in housing who slam the door when they arrive to do case management. That's a tough one for staff to work from, especially when they know their issues, especially when the landlords are starting to get on their case, about behaviors that are going on within a given complex, and they're asking the case managers to address it. I agree with you. It isn't one size fits all. It's just sometimes the way the rules are set up, they unintentionally conflict with each other. And I feel like to do what's ethically right means sometimes we're looking at, are we breaking the rules? Like, what if somebody doesn't score high enough on the vulnerability index? Because those are the questions that we have, and I'm not allowed to change them.
So
But they're super vulnerable, and we know that there are some very extenuating circumstances. And this may be many subpopulations, but with victim subpopulations, if the choice is finding somebody housing, or they go back to somebody who has already tried to strangle them and therefore has made them statistically likely to kill them.
Yeah.
How do we do what's right?
Yeah, and I think you nailed it. It's not a one size fits all. And further complicating things for you and the folks in California is HUD's just a small piece of the pie. We have large funding coming from the state of California, which is much more flexible. But that doesn't mean that you've implemented it locally flexibly, and you might have put things in place that aren't consistent with HUD, and you have to kind of do this nuance. I think the last thing I'll put out there, because you mentioned it, the VI SPDAT and assigning a number to humans is a horrible thing. It never truly captures the experience. And I think that's what you're saying is we have folks who don't score high enough to get a service, but darn well that they need that. And that's where case conferences come in. That's where working as a community together comes in. I've put it out there before. I think assigning numbers to humans has never worked out well for us, and I think the VI SPDAT has tried to do as well as anyone can. But at the end of the day, you still need a button on that thing that says, "I know better." There's more to the story than just this 14. It's also this, and this. So definitely, you're bringing up some great things that require very, very nuanced solutions locally for you to be able to negotiate, which makes your job very hard, Luis, for sure. Thank you for communicating with us today. Anna, I saw you come off mute at one point. Did you want to say something? Anna, you?
No, I'm good. Thank you. Thank you.
Great. Sorry, I thought I saw that. Anyone else wish to chime in this afternoon before we wrap up? I'd love to hear your thoughts, questions, just points of discussion, points of pain points you might be having or feeling around this.
We're certainly happy to field, I don't think the thing you said was right, good, or I don't agree with it. We're certainly happy to field those two.
All right. Well, I'm not seeing any. I want to thank you all for sticking with us this entire time. I want to thank Gordon and Mike for the presentation today. Kristen on the back end, keeping everything smooth for us. And thank you all for attending this California Housing Community Development Community Workshop session offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant, Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services Contract. Look out for more information on the next new and non-traditional providers workshop series session. A 3-question survey will pop up as this session ends. Please provide your feedback so that we can ensure these trainings are as useful as possible. We read everything you say, so please give us some good feedback or a negative feedback, whatever you need to provide to us so we can make these as useful as possible. Thank you much. See you next time.